This is Jay Callahan again. We've been talking about traumatic stress and dissociation, and I thought I would present a case of dissociative amnesia I saw back when I first worked in the emergency room. Now, if you've watched my introductory video, which is on the homepage of this class, you'll know that I worked years ago for many years, over 10 years, in a hospital emergency room at the University of Michigan, and I was in charge of all of the mental health professionals, the staff other than the psychiatrists and psychiatric residents who worked there. But I covered some shifts in the ER myself, and very early on, I think even before we created that special program, which was run by both the University of Michigan Department of Psychiatry and the local community mental health center. Before we even created that program, in the early days when I worked there, I saw this case that has stayed with me ever since, and fits for our description right now. Before we talk about the case, let me just mention that as we talk about dissociative amnesia, I normally think about it, and I think a lot of people normally think about it, as simply a part of traumatic stress. That is, the amnesia is an element or a symptom along with other symptoms when a person has been through a traumatic event. But and that is, I think, an accurate way to think about it. But sometimes the amnesia exists by itself, and in this case, there is a separate DSM diagnosis called dissociative amnesia. So before we talk about the case that I want to get into, let's talk first about what is dissociative amnesia. And this criterion A is probably the most important aspect of it. That is, it's an inability for a person to remember important autobiographical information, which is usually of a traumatic or stressful nature, and that inability to remember is not simply ordinary forgetfulness. It's not normal forgetting it, and when we get into this, you'll see that we're not talking about where did I leave my keys or is this Monday or Tuesday. There's a few other aspects of the diagnosis that kind of fill it out, although A is really the important part of it. B, of course, like we've seen with crisis itself and with ASD, PTSD, and many other disorders, that it has to cause significant distress or functional impairment. And remember, functional impairment is a person's inability to function at their normal level in their day-to-day activities. That the symptoms we're talking about here are not due to drugs or neurological or medical condition. And finally, that they're not better explained or understood or conceptualized as some other disorder, such as dissociative identity disorder or ASD or PTSD or whatever. Now, in addition, there is a subtype which is with dissociative fugue. In previous issues of the DSM, dissociative amnesia and dissociative fugue were thought of as separate disorders, but in the DSM-5, dissociative amnesia is the overarching disorder, and then dissociative fugue is a subtype. So this would be, with dissociative fugue, this would be the amnesia, the forgetfulness, the important forgetfulness. But in addition to that, it includes flight and taking on a new identity when a person gets wherever they're going, away from the scene of the original trauma. And as I mentioned before, there's a interesting current day case that was written up in the New York Times, and I've included that newspaper story in the reading for Sakai. So that's dissociative amnesia. And let me talk about Linda's story. Linda's a 17-year-old girl that I saw in the ER along with her family that had dissociative amnesia. So let me set the scene first, and this is that I'm working in the ER. I'm working on the day shift at 8 o'clock. I come in at 8 o'clock in the morning, and soon comes a family down the hall to us in our psychiatric emergency services offices from the main medical emergency room. And this family consists of a mom who was in her 40s, maybe 50s, and three fairly old kids who were ages 17, 20, and 21. Linda was the 17-year-old. And they were there because they had come to the ER because of the house fire that had happened that night. Their house caught on fire and burned down. And they came to the ER after that for treatment for smoke inhalation. That had been completed, and now, as you'll see in a second, they came down the hall to our psychiatric emergency services. So the story that the mom told me, who I interviewed first and separately from everybody else, was that it was an ordinary night, and in the middle of the night at 1 or 2 a.m. her husband woke her up and woke up the 3 kids and got everybody outside because the house was on fire. And it was seriously on fire. It eventually practically burned to the ground. But then, after everybody got out, and it's summertime, so they're standing around on the pavement. The fire department is there by then, attempting to put out the fire. But after he got them out, but before the fire department arrived, he did what they always say that you should never do, which is he goes back into the house. And unfortunately, he died in the fire. So the family standing around outside, the dad/husband does not come back outside. They're really upset, obviously. And the house is burning intensely. And eventually the fire chief comes over to them and says that he's really sorry, but he has to let them know that they found their dad and husband's, they found his body in the house, and unfortunately he died in the fire, and that his body had been taken to the morgue. So obviously they're really upset. The mom is telling me the story, and they're getting ready to come to the emergency room for the smoke inhalation. And one of the kids, her daughter Linda, though, not that long after the fire chief talked to them, and she was upset like everybody else initially. They were all crying, they were all really upset. But then abruptly her whole affect changed. She got kind of cheerful, and she said, there's no reason to be upset. Dad's okay. He went to work, and he'll be home at 5 o'clock like every other day. Now, as you can imagine, the mom and the siblings are really upset to hear this from Linda, and they're kind of freaked out. And at first they try to tell her, well, no, didn't you hear what the fire chief said? But she doesn't remember that. Doesn't remember Dad going back into the house, and insists that he'll be okay and he'll be home at 5 o'clock like every other day. So they're pretty freaked out by that, and then they come to the ER, and eventually I see the family. So this is an example of confabulation. Which may or may not be a part of dissociative amnesia. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. Confabulation is also very common with people with dementia, who obviously have problems with loss of memory. But confabulation is the unconscious production of false memories, typically to fill in for a memory gap. And it's not lying, it's not making it up, it's an unconscious process. And so not only did Linda have amnesia for the events that took place out in the street, but then she confabulated this memory of Dad saying, well, I'm going to go to work now and I'll be home at 5 o'clock. And she believed it, and the rest of her family, of course, was really upset about what had happened. So I interview Linda. I try to break through unsuccessfully. I interview Linda, and she tells me, a brief version of what happened. And in her version, Dad tells them, I'm going to work. And now there's it doesn't make any sense, obviously, that he would leave in the middle of a house fire at 3 a.m. or whatever and go to work. But that doesn't bother her, and dissociation can find its way to explain everything. That weird detail didn't seem to bother her at all. And she continued to insist that, he'll be home at 5 o'clock like every other day. So now, at the time, I didn't know very much about dissociation at all. Now I know a little bit more, and especially, as I think I alluded to you previously, it happened to me much later on. I'll talk about that in a different video. But I didn't know much about dissociation, and it's kind of a weird process, and to hear this story was certainly kind of weird. But I decided to try to get through to her. I'm not sure this was the right thing to do. I still haven't found a lot of literature about the acute treatment of dissociative amnesia. It's not like I've made a great literature search either, but I haven't seen much about this. There's certainly a huge literature about treatment for chronic dissociation, which may include amnesia, like for dissociative identity disorder, a huge literature, but not a whole lot that I know about acute amnesia. Acute dissociative amnesia. So, but I think, if this were to happen today, I would not have done this. And I think the way people tend to treat this kind of thing today is just to be supportive and back off and wait for it to wear off, which it typically does. But I didn't do that, so I sat Linda, well, she was already sitting down, and she told me her story, and I kind of leaned forward and looked very intensely in her eyes and said to Linda, I'm sorry to have to tell you this. Now you have to remember the family had been supporting her amnesia all along. Right? But I leaned in and said, Linda, I'm really sorry to be the one to tell you this, but unfortunately your dad died. He's dead. He died in the fire. He didn't go to work. He won't be home at 5 o'clock. I'm sorry. It's really bad. I'm sorry, but your dad died in the fire. So when I finished, she looked at me, and now if you're watching this video right now, if you're not looking at me, can you take a look and look at my face just for the next few seconds? So when I said that to Linda, she then looked like this. What? And then after just a few seconds, I don't know, 4 or 5 seconds of horror on her face, she got that eerie calm back again and said, no, that's not right. It's no problem. Dad went to work. He'll be home at 5 o'clock like every other day. So my attempt to break through was not successful. Again, I'm not sure I should do that, should have done that, but I tried and it didn't work. I worked for a few seconds, and then her dissociation came back around and covered itself over. And we'll talk more about that later. People who have dissociation to cover the dissociation. But let me get back to this case. So that didn't work, and I tried to make an appointment to have Linda come back and see me a few more days to see what was going on, but she was 17, and so it was up to the mom. Really, the mom, the parent, had decision-making ability in this case, and she didn't necessarily want that. She wouldn't come back. She wouldn't bring Linda back, but she agreed that we can stay in touch over the phone. And we had a few phone calls, and Linda continued to believe that Dad, went to work and he'd be home at 5 o'clock. Now, every day he didn't come home at 5 o'clock, but that didn't stop her. She continued to say that. It was very illogical and irrational, obviously, but she continued to believe that he would be home at 5 o'clock. So then finally I wasn't able to get any more close follow-up from that, but about 3 weeks later, the mom called me back and said that it wore off. And basically, they had a funeral, they had all a viewing and a funeral and everything, and Linda did not attend because, after all, Dad was at work and he'd be home at 5 o'clock. Again, there's all kinds of irrationality connected with the dissociative amnesia process, but that never stops anybody. So after about 3 weeks, on an average day, they were all at home doing whatever they were doing, and all of a sudden Linda begins crying and screaming and gets extremely upset. Excuse me, and then says, "Oh my God, I know what happened, and I was wrong all along, and what and how could I have done that, and how come I didn't remember?" And basically the amnesia wore off, and now she was able to remember everything that happened. And she was, of course, doubly upset that she had missed the funeral and had all the other arrangements and activities that surrounded the funeral. She was really upset, but the mom said, and I again invited Linda through the mom to come back and see me again, but the mom would not agree to that. And so that's really all I know that happened. But the amnesia happened, and the amnesia wore off after about 3 weeks. And again, maybe if I were to do it again, or I guess I would try to look into the literature. But I think the approach people have these days is to be supportive and non-confrontational, and wait for it simply to wear off, which it did in this case. All right, so that's our case of dissociative amnesia, and I'll see you again later with another video.